Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for this second keynote lecture of our conference. Now we are honored to have Paulina Restrepo-Echavarria with us. She is a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Her research interests are on the fields of international macroeconomics and search theory. Her work has been published in American Economic Review, Journal of Economic Theory, and the European Economic Review, among others. She teaches international economics for PhD students at the Washington University in St. Louis. Paulina received her PhD in economics from UCLA in 2010. I leave the screen to Paulina, who will give her lecture entitled The International Consequences of Bretton Woods Capital Controls and the Value of Geopolitical Stability. Paulina, the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll be talking today. I'll share my screen here, and this is joint work with Leo Hanian at UCLA, Diana Van Patten, who's at Yale, and Mark Wright, who's at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And our research agenda more broadly is about capital flows and the direction of capital flows. So a very important experiment worldwide that has determined the direction of capital flows has been Bretton Woods. So basically here we're going to be focusing on the relationship between the direction of capital flows and the importance of geopolitical stability around the world between 1950 and 2010, roughly. And for which, the Bretton Woods Agreement was in place between 1950 and 1973, more or less, okay? So when we look at JSTOR, for example, and we look at how many studies have been done with respect to Bretton Woods, you see that there are around 25,000 papers written on this topic. So then the question is, well, why one more? Well, it turns out that virtually all of the analysis that has been done with respect to Bretton Woods, and I'll talk in a moment about the details, of what comprised the agreement per se, have been written about nominal exchange rate policies, okay? So what we argue here is, well, it turns out Bretton Woods was a huge packet of controls ranging from fixed exchange rates for sure, but a lot of it had to do with international capital mobility impediments. And these impediments to international capital mobility have been largely overlooked in the literature. So we think that this is a very important open question, since Bretton Woods has been by far the largest experiment in imposing impediments to capital mobility around the world, okay? So what are we going to do here? So in the next 45, 50 minutes or so, I'm going to show you a general equilibrium multi-region model in which we analyze the positive and the normative effects of the Bretton Woods impediments to international capital mobility on the world economy. And in particular, I'll show you that we'll be able to separate out the impact of the international capital mobility impediments from the exchange rate effects on the world economy throughout this period. And what we find is that the Bretton Woods impediments to international capital mobility really reduced world output during those 50-something years. They significantly reduced the welfare of the United States, while they increased the welfare for Europe and the rest of the world. And who's the rest of the world? This is important. So the rest of the world here is comprised by Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on the one hand, then East Asia on the other, so mainly the Asian tigers, which were largely driven by Japan, and Latin America. Okay, so Latin America has a big role here during this period as playing a big part in the rest of the world. And so what we're going to argue is that, because basically when we think about this agreement and the fact that there were 44 countries participating in it, and we say, well, it turns out that the US welfare was greatly reduced by participating in this agreement, this really begs the question of how could this have been? Because as I'll talk in a moment, it turns out that the US was one of the main negotiator for the agreement. It turns out that at that time, when this was being negotiated in 1944, the US had a lot of bargaining power, because at the end of the day, the US was a country that was not destroyed by the war, while Europe was. So the US had a lot to say in terms of how the Bretton Woods Agreement was structured. And so when we see that the big loser from the agreement itself was the US, this really begs the question of, okay, what happened? Was it the case that they did not realize that they were going to lose so much by participating on this agreement? Or did they know and they willingly participated and were willing to lose in terms of consumption? So what we're going to show and argue is that really these welfare laws on the side of the US was as a cost of attempting to preserve international economic and political stability. And this was based on a broader political agenda by the US that they were trying to implement during the Cold War. So I'll talk more extensively about this issue. So let's talk a little bit about what was Bretton Woods, okay? And as I said, Bretton Woods had one main aim at the end of the day. So there were 44 countries participating. And the main point of the agreement, so the big picture of the agreement in a nutshell, was that there was going to be one currency of reference. That currency of reference was to be pegged to gold. And then the exchange rates of all the other countries participating were mainly going to be fixed with respect to the US dollar. So to be able to implement, this system where you had these fixed exchange rates with respect to the US dollar, and given that the US dollar ended up being pegged to gold, then there had to be two sides of the coin. One side was the exchange rates and the fact that they were fixed. But in order for a country to be able to maintain fixed exchange rates, you need to implement impediments to international capital mobility in order to sustain right, those fixed exchange rates. So the two sides were implemented, countries implemented these capital controls to keep their fixed change, their exchange rates fixed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the main negotiators of the agreement were the US and Europe. And specifically, on behalf of the US, we had Harry Dexter White carrying the negotiation. He was the US Treasury Secretary at the time. And for Europe, we had John Maynard Keynes leading the negotiation. And so the first thing, and something that is very telling about how much bargaining power the US had versus Europe, was that Keynes at the time did not want the US dollar to be the currency of reference. He wanted to create a new currency, which was supposed to be called the banker, and the banker was supposed to be the currency. But at the end of the day, Harry Dexter White had more incidence on this decision, and the US dollar, as I said, ended up being the currency of reference. Now, what were the goals with the Bretton Woods Agreement, or why did it actually come to life? Why did they want to implement this agreement? Well, there were very different motivations, and I think that in some way it was out of fear that they wanted to implement it. What do I mean by that? So we know that we're standing at the end of the Second World War, okay? So think about 1946. At this point in time, they were very worried about what was going to happen with labor markets around the world. Why? Because the war was just over, and all the people that were involved in the war were going to now come into labor markets. So labor force participation was going to increase greatly. And so the question, or the first question was, okay, will labor markets be able to absorb all this increase in labor force participation? What will happen in general with the economy? There was kind of a very gloomy view or what was going to happen in the next 10 years. They were very negative about the prospects of growth, around economic growth around the world. So that was one thing. And then we have to take into account all the different experiences of the different events that happened between World War I and World War II. So specifically, they were kind of concerned of letting markets work on their own, because we know that in 1929, we had the big market crash. So to some extent, there was some hesitation about free markets. And at the same time, they were also like, well, we don't want to leave this entirely on the hands of governments, because also between the First World War and the Second World War, there were a lot of governments that acted unilaterally in order to take advantage, or that's what they thought, of other different governments through implementing different types of policies. So more specifically, we had what is referred to as the trade wars. So there were countries that implemented quotas in order to prevent capital flow from flowing into their countries. Then we had countries who implemented unilateral devaluations, also to take some advantage of trade. So they were trying to, in some sense, keep governments under control, but at the same time, they didn't want to rely on free markets because of the 29 experience. At the same time, there was a lot of fear, I would say, about capital flights and volatile nominal exchange rates, because the world experienced those in the 1930s. And specifically, there was a lot of capital flight from Latin America into the US. And so they were pretty worried about this. And finally, all of these factors would have a lot to do with ally recovery. So they really wanted to maintain, the best economic health possible in order to prevent any damage to ally recoveries. Also, to least developed country growth, they wanted to encourage least developed country growth and international political stability. And that point is pretty key, because those capital flights that were seen around the world in the 30s were very related to political pressures that were being instituted by the Nazis in Latin America specifically. So the US was very fearful that Latin America will fall in the hands of first the Nazis and then the Soviets. And so they really wanted to try to maintain a healthy economic environment for them, such that they were not at risk of political instability. So this was, in general, a very big and broad political agenda that the US was really trying to maintain. And Bretton Woods came into place to try to support that political agenda and try to keep economic stability around the world. And so it turns out that the treaty itself was also very complex from an institutional standpoint. Bretton Woods actually created what we know today as the IMF and the World Bank. And why did they create the IMF and the World Bank? They had different purposes. So the World Bank was initially instituted in order to reconstruct Europe. So the World Bank was in charge of making all the transfers that were necessary in order to reconstruct Europe. And then the IMF was created in order to prevent speculative capital flows. What did they mean by that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Bretton Woods Agreement had kind of two sides to it. It had the fixed exchange rates, and then it had the impediments to international capital mobility, or the capital controls. And it turns out those capital controls had to be all instituted through the IMF, meaning that countries were not really deciding on these capital controls on their own, but they were going to implement these policies through the IMF such that there was no disadvantage between one country or the other, okay? So the IMF was really this monitoring institution that was going to help them, you know, implement these policies. And so these policies were both nominal exchange rate controls and impediments to international capital mobility, as I mentioned. And as you can imagine, of course, this is a very complex environment to try to model, you know, for us. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to take what we call international business cycle accounting to capture all these Bretton Woods policies within one or more distortions. And more specifically, for those familiar with this literature, if you're not familiar, it's okay. I'll walk you through what we do. We follow the closed economy business cycle accounting literature initiated by Colin Ohanian and Chariki McGrath in 2007. And then we move forward and we go to an open economy version of that business cycle accounting methodology, which is a methodology that we developed with Lee and Mark in our 2018 paper. And we take that benchmark and we say, okay, we're going to go one step further and we're going to consider exchange rates such that we can show how Bretton Woods exchange rate controls and international capital mobility impediments show up as one single distortion in one of the model's first order conditions. And furthermore, we show that we can separately identify the role of international capital mobility impediments from fixed exchange rate effects from this one distorted first order condition. And that's what we think is kind of really very neat about what we're bringing to the table in terms of an identification strategy for Bretton Woods. So let me move to the model. So we're going to have three regions, okay, participating in the world economy. One of the regions or countries, I will talk indistinctively about regions or countries, is going to be the US. The second one is Europe, and Europe is going to be constituted basically by Western and Northern European countries. And then we're going to have the rest of the world, which, as I mentioned earlier, is constituted by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Asian tigers, and all of the main countries in Latin America. Okay, so then we have those three regions interacting with each other. As I mentioned, and at the point that I've made up to now, we know that the main designers of the Bretton Woods Agreement were the US and Europe, and a lot of the aim of the agreement was to protect the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is all those countries that I mentioned. And I talked about, that specific importance of developing countries, in particular Latin America, in all of this, the role they played in how the agreement itself was designed. Okay, so then think about a model economy where we have these three countries or these three regions. They're going to interact with each other through trade. And I'll be very specific about that. More than trade is there's going to be capital flowing, okay, from one country to the other. And in each country, what we're going to have is households are going to do the following. Households are going to maximize the expected discounted present value of their utility function, which is over here. And this utility function is going to depend positively on consumption per capita. So C is consumption, N is population. So here we have consumption per capita. And it depends on hours worked. So there's a disutility, right? Because there's a negative sign here. There's a disutility from working. And these are the total number of hours worked per person times population over here. And what they're going to do is that they're going to maximize this utility function subject to a budget constraint that is going to apply for every single state and date. And this budget constraint is going to state the following. It's going to state that consumption for each one of the, so this is for a particular country or region, right? Plus new capital goods denoted by KT plus 1, which are priced at a price PK, plus state contingent assets B, okay, or bonds, which are priced at a price Q, and note that this price is common to all the countries in the world. So this is an important thing to consider from a technical standpoint. So in the model, we're going to have complete markets, okay? And so think about these bonds as being arrow securities, okay? So these are arrow securities, which will cover you in any state of the world at a given point in time. And the price of these state contingent bonds is shared by every single country in the world, okay? It's the same one. And so this price here, Q, incorporates the probability of a certain state of the world arising, and that's why this is written, you know, with the expected value in period T over here, okay? This part, you know, which are expenses, have to be less or equal to your income, which is constituted by the following. So people work, and they work, as I mentioned, a total number of hours H. There's a population N, so this is the total amount of work in the economy. And it's remunerated by W, so wages, right? W here is what they get paid. Now note that we have a friction over here, which is a distortion on domestic labor markets, but really it's a distortion that is isomorphic to a tax on labor income, okay? So, and this is going to play actually an important role, because we have found in our previous research with Lee and Mark that it turns out that labor market frictions are extremely important for explaining the direction of capital flows. Actually, they're more important than any friction on domestic capital markets or international capital markets, okay? So this is going to play an important role over here. Then we have what we call old capital goods. Old capital goods are valued at a price, PK star, and there is a return to capital, RK. The only non-standard feature that you'll see here compared to a neoclassical growth model, for example, would be that old capital goods are priced at a price PK star, while new capital goods over here are priced at a price K. And the reason for the difference between these two prices, I'll show you in a moment, is that we have investment adjustment costs, and that's going to be the only difference. Apart from that, this is absolutely standard. Then the other thing to note is that capital is going to face this distortion over here. So in other words, domestic capital markets face a distortion that is isomorphic to a tax on your return to capital. And so these two components, the distortion on domestic labor markets and the distortion on domestic capital markets, these exist in the literature, okay? So these two objects are present in the business cycle accounting literature, the closed economy business cycle accounting literature. So this is not new to our work. What is really new to our work is this component over here. Here's where the novelty of all of this comes in, which is we have state contingent assets over here, with B on the right-hand side of the budget constraint, and note that these state contingent assets are facing this distortion, okay? So this sum of this tau B star and this psi over here represent a distortion on international capital markets. And as you can see, there's a difference, right, between those distortions implemented on the labor market and the distortions that are faced in domestic capital markets, because here we only have one component. We have the tau K, we have the tau H. But when we go to the international side of it, to international capital markets, now the distortion on the international front is comprised of two terms. One is the tau B, and another one is this psi. So why is this the case? Well, it turns out that even though we have complete markets, so when we think about an open economy model with complete markets, and we have homothetic preferences, then we know that consumption is going to be pinned down by the relative size of one region to the other. So relative consumptions are immediately determined within the model. Well, it turns out that here, because we have this tax that we are introducing, this distortion on your return to international assets, we no longer can identify consumption out of relative consumption or out of the relative size of the two different regions. What this implies is that technically we're losing long-run stationarity in consumption within the model. So because we lose long-run stationarity in consumption, we have to introduce something to gain that back. And that's what this psi here represents. This is a portfolio adjustment cost, which I'll talk about more in detail later, which is going to help us recover that stationarity in consumption. But the bottom line here, and what I want everyone to remember, is that we have this overall distortion on international capital markets. It's comprised of this portfolio adjustment cost, which is literally a technicality. Okay, it's a technical necessity for us to be able to solve the model. And then we have this component over here, which is a tax. Okay, it's isomorphic. It's a friction or a distortion that is isomorphic to a tax on the return to international assets. And so it turns out that this tau b star is going to be the star component, of our model. This is what we're going to care about, because I'll show you and I'll argue that this tau b star actually represents really well the Bretton Woods Agreement. And by being able to recover this from our model, we are recovering or uncovering all the different policies that were implemented over the years by the different countries by Bretton Woods, okay? And so what we're going to do is that we're going to experiment with shutting down or removing this tau b star here to ask ourselves what would have happened if Bretton Woods had not been in place, okay? What would have happened to the economy around the world if we didn't have Bretton Woods, okay? And that's going to be the key question here. So to finish this, note that households own domestic firms, so profits from domestic firms buy, and the government collects all of these taxes and rebates them back to households as a transfer, denoted by T here. So there's Ricardian equivalence, okay, without loss of generality in our model. Okay, so what about consumption goods sector? It turns out it's completely standard. The consumption goods sector is going to hire labor and capital, and they're going to produce according to a Cobb-Douglas production function. So there's complementarity between labor and capital. This is important for some of the mechanisms. And there's an investment goods sector, and the investment goods sector is going to produce new capital goods, KT plus 1, using I units of deferred consumption. So this is investment, and they're going to use KJT old capital goods to maximize their profits. This equation is actually completely standard. The only difference, note, is that here we have PK, and as I mentioned earlier, this is the price of new capital goods. This is substituting for the capital accumulation equation. So this in parentheses, in the squared parentheses, this is KT plus 1. This is capital tomorrow. And capital tomorrow is what we have of capital today minus what was depreciated plus what we invest. And the only difference is that we have this term here, which is investment adjustment cost. So the investment adjustment costs are, again, a technical necessity, because when you're dealing with open economy models, we know that these models have extremely volatile investment. So to be able to hit the moments of the data, of the observed data, we have to introduce some sort of tempering to investment volatility. and we introduce it through these investment adjustment costs. So then we have the price of new capital goods times the new capital goods over here, minus what we invest, minus old capital goods times the price, okay, that they have. And finally, the resource constraint states that the sum of consumptions around the world, so the consumption in all the 3 regions or 3 countries, plus the investment in all the regions, plus the government spending, has to be equal to the sum of the output, okay? So this just reflects the fact that we have a Cobb-Douglas production function, or case capital, and here we have total number of hours worked. And A is a total factor productivity term, which is going to be exogenous. So if we do a recap of the different objects that we have in the model, note that we have several stochastic objects. So population is going to be stochastic. Productivity here, or efficiency, is going to be stochastic. Government spending is stochastic as well. Okay, so there we have 3. If I go back one slide over here, we have other three components that are stochastic. One is the distortion on domestic capital markets, the distortion on labor markets, and the distortion on international markets, okay? So we have all of those components which are stochastic in the model. And finally, note one thing that is relevant here. See that bonds do not appear here in the resource constraint. This is the resource constraint for the whole world. So this nets out trade, okay? So meaning that the sum of bonds around the world has to be equal to 0. Okay, so what is the evolution of uncertainty here? This is all kind of just technical necessities, but they are important because US population and productivity, they're going to grow over time. And so we needed to take a stand on how to model that growth. So what we assume is that the US, so the U here, you know, the subscript U in our variables stands for United States. We assume that population and productivity in the United States evolve according to a random walk with drift, like these 2 equations, meaning that they're going to have growth rates eta and pi, sorry. And what we assume is, of course, Europe and the rest of the world are not going to, or did not grow at the rate that the US grew during this time period. So we need to adjust that growth rate for population and productivity for Europe and the rest of the world. And so we assume that population and productivity in Europe and the rest of the world evolve relative to the US, so they inherit the component of population and productivity of the United States, which, you know, grow according to these random walks with drift. But we have these stationary components, which are going to adjust the level, right, and the slope of these 2 other components that are growing, okay? So apart from that, we assume that all distortions, taxes, or controls, however you want to think of those, are going to evolve as autoregressive processes of order 1, like the one that we have here. And the other thing is, so let me, okay, here. And this will imply that because productivity and population in the United States are growing, we need to scale all the variables in the model by a stochastic trend in effective population that looks like this, okay, like this first equation. Once we detrend the model, it turns out that productivity in the United States and population are going to be stationary, okay, and they're going to be IID. And finally, the last thing, which I already mentioned to some extent, is, as I showed you, we lose stationarity in long run relative consumptions because of the distortion on international capital markets. And so in order to be able to regain that stationarity, we need to make two assumptions. We need to assume that there are no capital controls in the long run. So the steady state, okay, of that international distortion is equal to 0. And there's mean reversion in relative consumption levels through this equation here. So if you remember, these are the portfolio adjustment costs that I showed you are affecting the return to international assets. And they have to behave in specifically this manner in order for us to be able to regain mean reversion in relative consumption levels, okay? So remember the following. I argued at the very beginning that I was going to talk about exchange rates, and up to now, right, this model has no exchange rate whatsoever, right? Because, sorry, this is doing something weird. This one has no exchange rates because I've shown you a completely real model where we only have tradable goods. So how come I said that we were going to be able to separately identify effects from exchange rates from effects of international capital mobility impediments? So here's the deal. So imagine the following. Imagine that we have a model where we not only have tradable goods, but we have non-tradable goods, okay? If we have non-tradable goods, an easy way for those familiar with international economics is to think about the model that I just showed you meets Backus-Smith, okay, 93. And the only difference that that's going to make in the setup that we just looked at is that now this consumption over here is not only tradable consumption, but that consumption is now a consumption bundle like the one we have down here on the screen. And that consumption bundle is going to be made up of tradable consumption goods denoted by X and non-tradable consumption goods denoted by D. A key assumption here, and this is, this is a very simple way of modeling exchange rates, okay? Because we introduce non-tradables, but we assume that these non-tradables are exogenous, okay? So we have an exogenous endowment of non-traded goods. And because we have an exogenous endowment of non-traded goods, we assume that we consume all of those, that full endowment that we get period by period of non-traded goods, we consume it. And then there's this price, PD, which is the price of the non-traded goods. And the price of non-traded goods adjusts in order to clear the market, okay, given the realization of the endowment of the non-traded goods. Apart from that, everything else is the same, okay? So, and the important part, as I mentioned before, is this component here, this distortion on international financial assets, okay? So what's the difference? If you think about the Euler equation of these models, okay? So think about the model without non-traded goods, okay? So think about the model that I started with, where consumption is just tradable goods. And so in that model, if we look at the Euler equation for state contingent international assets, we get this third equation over here. So I want you to focus on that third equation. Okay, and this third equation, what it's saying basically is that this international distortion over here is equal to the growth rate of consumption. But there's one key thing, and it's the following. Note that the discount factor beta, and I mentioned that the price Q for these state contingent international assets is the same for every country. This means that I cannot separately identify this object for each one of our 3 regions. This implies that I can only identify this object over here for 2 out of the 3 regions that we have. So we're only going to be able to identify the international distortion in relative terms with respect to one of our countries. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to identify the international distortion for the US and the international distortion for Europe with respect to the rest of the world, okay? And so hold this equation in mind, okay? If we take this equation, which remember is the equation that is coming from the model without non-traded goods, so there are no exchange rates present in this setup, okay? If we take this equation and we equate it for 2 out of the 3 regions that we have in the model, then we're going to get this first equation on this slide, which is just telling us the following. It's telling us that the ratio here in the middle, the ratio of the international distortion of, let's say, the United States relative to that of the rest of the world is equal to the growth rate of relative consumptions. Meaning that this distortion, which I'm going to denote by theta, is fully identified, okay, by the growth rate of relative consumptions. Now, imagine that you do exactly the same for the model where we have non-tradable goods. Well, it turns out that in the model with non-tradable goods, the Euler equations for state contingent assets imply the following. We get exactly the same term here as we did before, meaning that, you know, the growth rate of relative consumptions is identifying a chunk, okay, of this international distortion. But now we have an extra term here. This extra term, if you note, is the growth rate of the exchange rates. Why? Because here in this model, we can define as the real exchange rate, Q, to be PJT over PRT. So basically, the real exchange rate is defined as the relative price of one country versus the other. And wait, this moved forward for some reason. And this is not letting me move it anymore. So let me move this way. So I'll go back to here. Okay, so let me share that again because for some reason it froze. There you go. Okay, so it should be back on. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Let me try and see if it works with the full screen because it had frozen. So, okay. So if we think that the exchange rate is defined as the relative price, likewise here. So it's telling me that it's not moving. Can you guys see the slides move? You cannot, right?
No, not yet.
Yeah, it's telling me that it's not allowing them to move. So give me a second. It's kind of strange. I'll stop sharing again and
Okay, don't worry.
I think that should do it. Let's see. There. Can you see it move now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that should fix it. It's happened a couple of times. I don't know why it happens. Okay, so think about the following. So now we have these 2 possible setups. Okay, we have the setup where we have the non-tradable goods, which generates this Euler equation for state contingent assets. And we have the case where we only have tradable goods. And that generates this Euler equation for state contingent assets. So this one, which has this extra term where we have exchange rates and we have the growth rate of relative consumptions, these 2 terms are multiplicatively separable, right? So that's wonderful news because at the end of the day, what do we care about? We care about the fact that we can separately identify this component from this component. So what we're going to do, and this is again like jumping, okay, slides for some reason. Okay, we're going to try and see if these two components are orthogonal to each other, are they correlated or not? And so we can do this easily in some sense because we have data for consumption, we have data for population, and we have exchange rate data. And so if we regress or the log of the international capital controls, which is, you know, this term here, or, you know, the log of the relative consumption growth rates on the growth rate of the exchange rate, well, it turns out that the R squared of that is roughly 0. So this allows us to focus basically on the model without non-traded goods, where the international distortion is fully identified by international capital controls. Why? Because, well, it turns out this is really noise to some extent. And I mean, this doesn't come as a surprise, right? Because if you know from international macro, the Backus-Smith puzzle is exactly that. It's showing that really there's a very low relationship between exchange rates and real variables here. So this zeta NTB really is a reflection of the Backus-Smith puzzle. And what we argue is, well, these two are orthogonal. We can ignore or shut down this noise and stick with the model where the international wedge is fully identified by this component over here. And so that's what we do. We're going to say, okay, we're going to stick with the model where we only have tradable goods. And so the growth rate of relative consumptions is going to capture international capital controls. And so if we do that, we're going to argue that what we need to do is, well, okay, we need to, this froze again. There you go. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and recover all the different distortions that we have, both in the domestic capital market front and in the international capital market front. And we're going to do that by solving a log linear approximation around the steady state. We're going to do a second order approximation because we're going to deal with welfare analysis. And we're going to set parameters governing preferences, production, and adjustment costs to parameters that are very common in the literature. And then we're going to estimate some others by using maximum likelihood estimation. So for this, we use the Kalman filter to calculate the likelihood and recover the distortions. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that our model, with all the separate distortions that I showed you guys, so basically with the domestic distortion in labor markets, domestic distortion on capital markets, productivity, government spending, and the distortion on international capital markets, they're all going to account for data on output, consumption, hours, investment, population, and net exports. Exactly, okay? What this means is that when we solve for the policy functions of our model and we fit in what we estimate for the different distortions, we will recover exactly the observed data for the world, okay? So one of the big things that we did for this project is that we gathered a lot of data on different countries. So here are the groups of countries. I already talked about what they are. And what is really key here is that our data includes roughly 75% of the world GDP as of 1950. So we're doing really well in terms of capturing as much, you know, of the world as possible in our methodology. Okay, so how did capital flows look like around the world during this period? Well, it turns out that the US, you know, and Europe, you can see the US is the blue line, Europe is the red line, all the way up to 1973, which was the year where Bretton Woods ended, or the fixed exchange rate dimension of Bretton Woods ended. There are very few capital flows around the world, okay? These were very close to zero. The rest of the world here, note that because we only have 75% of the world GDP, the residual is thrown into the rest of the world, okay? Because we don't have Soviet countries because of data issues, and we don't have China, we don't have India because they were not market economies, so our model doesn't capture their behavior really well. So this rest of the world nets out all of those countries, okay? But the bottom line is that during the Bretton Woods era, you know, there were very few capital flows over here, okay? Okay, so if we move on and we say, okay, how did Bretton Woods look like in terms of our model, okay? And in terms of our model, here's how it looked like. So if I show you how the tau B stars look like, which if you remember I mentioned, we argue that this really captures the impediments to international capital mobility imposed by Bretton Woods because they're fully identified by changes in the growth rate of relative consumption, which really is a sign of a country's ability to smooth out consumption, right? And so in that sense, that dotted line that we see here, dotted lines, because there are two, there's one for the US in blue and one red for Europe, right? Those two dotted lines are showing the behavior of the international distortions imposed by Bretton Woods that abstract from exchange rates, right? So this is only the impediments to capital mobility chunk. And the solid lines here are just the HP filters of those dotted lines. Why? Because, well, the dotted lines are pretty choppy, very high frequency and kind of hard to see. And what really matters from here is the sign. The sign is important. So whenever we see a tau B star or a distortion that is negative, that means that there's a tax on foreign borrowing. And value that is positive reflects a tax on foreign saving. So what really matters is that during the Bretton Woods period, there were taxes on foreign borrowing faced by the US and Europe that were increasing over time all the way to around 1970, and then they revert and they go back. So then it makes sense to run a counterfactual where we remove impediments to international capital mobility imposed by Bretton Woods. And when we do that experiment, well, I'm going to brush through this, but this just means that there's a structural break in that time series that I showed you in 1973, meaning that there's a very different behavior of the time series before 1973 and post 1973. And so if we remove that international distortion, which you know, in the paper we do devote quite a bit of time to mapping, okay, that tau B star to different policies that were implemented around the world during that time period, and we show actually that the peaks and downs of that time series that we find line really well with the actual policies that were implemented around the world. So once we show that, we say, okay, this is really a very good reflection. We're capturing really well the different policies implemented by Bretton Woods, among other things, obviously. And so we can experiment with removing those. And so if we experiment with removing those, here's what would have happened with consumption, output, capital, and hours. But what really matters is not what happened with these variables, but what happened to capital flows. It turns out that if we remove those distortions to international capital mobility, what that implies is that relative consumption per capita has this behavior. So the dotted line is the counterfactual. So consumption both in the US and in Europe is higher than it was under the benchmark. So it would have been higher than the observed consumption around the world. And what imply is that capital would have flown to the US, which is the blue dotted line here, in very large quantities. Europe would have some capital flight actually at the beginning of the period, but it's not that big. And there would be massive capital outflows from the rest of the world, all flowing to the US, okay? And so if we look at how that reflects on output, well, output would have been much larger around the world without the Bretton Woods Agreement. And when we look at welfare, well, it turns out that the US in consumption equivalent lost 4.4% of their consumption. Europe gained 1.3, and the rest of the world gained around 4.5. So here's where we, like where I started. And I started by saying, well, it turns out we find that the US is a really big loser from the Bretton Woods Agreement. They lost around 4.4% of their consumption equivalent. And so why did they do that? And well, you can see that the behavior of the capital flows that I showed you really supports what I started with, which was, well, Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes were really worried about the fact that if the Bretton Woods Agreement was not implemented around the world, then we would observe massive capital flight around the world. And specifically, we would see capital flying out of developing countries. And remember that developing countries are a big driver of the rest of the world. And that's exactly what we would have seen, according to our counterfactual experiment, happen around the world, okay? Huge capital flights. And so these help us conclude, which is, reach our conclusion, which is, well, as I said earlier, where the US really wanted to promote allied reconstruction, these developed country growth, they wanted to support friendly governments. As I said, they really wanted to prevent Latin America from the influence of Nazis and Soviets. And there was a big belief that international capital markets were prone to crisis. And so crises drain capital, they depress growth, they create political instability. And so that was the main purpose of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And so really what we argue is that the US was really willing to pay, to prevent all that capital flight. And so our findings, we interpret them really as an estimate of the perceived value of capital controls to support a broader, very expensive international policy agenda. So a result that may not make a lot of sense from an economic standpoint turns out to be, make a lot of sense from a geopolitical point of view, because even though we know that from a, welfare perspective, the US was the big loser and basically was taking one for the team, it's really hard to tell what would have happened if the US and Europe had not agreed, to try to prevent capital from flowing around the world during that time, because we don't know in the counterfactual, what would have happened with political stability. And this is an important point because we think this has been largely overlooked in almost all open economy post-World War II studies. And so we think that integrating political economy and defense goals into international models may shed new light on policy choices and their effects on the economies around the world. So I'll finish up with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paulina. Excellent. We collected 2 questions, so I will start with the first one. You mentioned that labor frictions were very important. Hence, measuring total hours seems a key input in analysis. Could you please tell us a bit more? How did you measure this variable in Latin American countries?
Yes, so unfortunately, I never have enough time to show that, but I'll show you. I think I have a plot of this here. Yes. So this distortion is basically fully identified by per capita hours worked. Okay, so per capita hours worked have this behavior in Europe, the red line, and the rest of the world is the green line, the US is the blue line. And you can see that the labor market distortions are basically the inverse of this. So think about Europe, that's the clearest example of all. So it turns out that Europe at the beginning of the period works a ton, and then they start working way less. How is this identified by the model? How does the model interpret this excess hours worked and the decline in them? Well, it interprets those excess hours, that excess in hours worked, as a very small distortion on labor markets, basically none, right? So this is around 0. So basically it says, okay, if people are working very much, it's because labor markets are not distorted. And if hours start going down, then that means that there has to be some increase happening in the distortions present in domestic labor markets, okay? That's just, what identifies that within the model. However, when you go and check how do these labor market distortions identified by the model, which are basically identified off of per capita hours work, you see that they line up remarkably well with consumption taxes and labor income taxes. So in Europe, for example, labor income taxes had a large increase, a dramatic increase over the years, over the first 20 years. And there are several papers on this. And this is captured really well by our labor wedge, okay? And so how is this important? This is important for capital flows through the complementarity of labor and capital, because there's no point in bringing capital into your country if you don't have labor to accompany that capital. So that deters capital from flowing into your country.
Thank you. I have another one, probably will be the last one. Even in the absence of non-traded goods, shouldn't you take into account the exchange rate when you have dual exchange rates? For instance, one for the current account of the balance of payment and other for the capital account, as it was in the case of many European countries in the Bretton Woods aftermath? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that you're saying, well, exchange rates are sufficiently important, and we also know that they vary depending on, like what's the object that you base them on and so on, right? The thing is for us, and our take on this is that there's really no consensus on what's the right model of exchange rates, okay? If you look in the literature at all the different models of exchange rates, none of them does a fantastic job at generating observed data, none of them. And specifically, when you think about using those models to identify domestic distortions, they do very poorly. So then that begs the question of, well, we really don't have a good benchmark model for exchange rates. And so if we don't even have a good model for exchange rates, how are we going to use that to identify anything directly from the data if we already know that the models have really bad performance, okay? So our personal take, and this is something that Lee, Mark, and I have argued for a very long time as well, is really useful to look at this from a real perspective, right? From a perspective based on real variables, because our measurement of real variables is much more accurate. And at the end of the day, we do have models that are very good at explaining those variables, okay? So can we answer these types of questions through the lens of a model that is real? And that's what we try to do here. And this is based on the fact that if we think about the simplest model of exchange rates, which would be the Backus-Smith, there's a very clean identification of the two components, right? There's a very clean identification of the exchange rate effects versus the capital mobility impediments. And this is due, to the assumption that non-tradable goods are exogenous, and the composite price of tradables and non-tradables is determined only by the price of the non-tradables, and that clears markets, okay? So yes, this might be a stark assumption, but that model doesn't do any worse than any of the other models that we know of, in some sense, when we look at the different dimensions of the data, I would say. So this is why we think that this is a fair way of going about it.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for the last one. So previous to the Bretton Woods end, there were some real rigidities, liquidity constraints, price and wage stickinesses, and slower productivity growth. Have you considered to include some of these features later in the model? Thank you.
Liquidity constraints. So I think that a lot of those are captured by our different wedges. So you can think about many different types of models and how they map into our wedges. So the short answer, I guess, to this question, because it could be like a very long answer, is all of that is captured actually by our wedges, our distortions. And if we wanted to, I guess something that we've done several times in different dimensions is we can take what we recover the distortions to be. So for example, this is a good example what I showed you, the labor market distortions, right? I argued how, for example, this increase in the labor market distortion for Europe lines up really well with taxes on consumption and labor income, you know, which were largely increasing in Europe. You can do that for all our different wedges and see how they line up with actually policy changes that were implemented, you know, in labor markets, capital markets, both in the domestic and in the international dimension, and see how all of that is really nested and included in our setup, because it's very agnostic.
Okay, well, thank you, Paulina. It has been an amazing lecture, and I think we all enjoy it. So thank you all who are watching. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Paulina.
It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.